Well, welcome back. This is the taping of my TMT with Mike O'Reilly, and my guest today needs no introduction. It is, of course, former FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. Thank you so very much for taking the time out to do this taping. I appreciate your hospitality in your home, and I really want to get to some ideas of and to hear about what you've been up to since 3.5 years have passed since you exited the FCC. Can you believe it's been that long?
It feels like yesterday.
Right?
It's so good to be back with you, Mike. I wish we were working together again, but it's always good to see a friend from the trenches in the private sector.
So what have you been? You're at Searchlight Capital Partners.
Yeah.
What do you get to do for them? How are you enjoying your time?
It's been great. So I've been at the firm 3 years ago this month, and it's been a great experience so far. I am a full member, a partner on the deal team, and so I work on all phases of the business, from helping the firm on the investor relations side, raising funds from current or prospective LPs to continue to invest in our funds, as well as helping to source deals that may be of interest to the firm, diligencing those companies. So once we think we might have a fit there, working to make sure that it is, in fact, going to be a good investment. And then once we do the transaction, sitting on the board or otherwise helping with execution. And so it's really been an education for me on all phases of the private equity business.
What portion can you equate to being telecom related or technology related to compared to other aspects of the investments?
So certainly the bulk of my work is focused on tech and telecom, broadly speaking, in media. So for example, we have in the portfolio Consolidated Communications and Ziply Fiber, which are broadband providers in predominantly the New England and Northwest areas, respectively. Univision is another company, Televisa Univision, and so that's more on the broadcast side. Then we recently established a digital infrastructure fund to invest in broadband companies that are smaller in scale but looking to grow based in part on BEAD funding. And so we have All Points Broadband in Virginia, which we closed in 2021. WeCom Fiber and Mainstream Fiber, which are in Arizona and Indiana respectively, which we closed in 2023, and hopefully making a few more investments in that vein. So the bulk of what I do day to day is telecom, but I also help on the other portfolio companies that we have. So TMT is certainly the backbone of our firm and has been since we were established in 2010. But we have deep experience in other sectors too: healthcare, fintech, business services, industrials. And so on an as-needed basis, I've been able to pitch in on some of those other portfolio companies too. In addition, one of the other things which I didn't really appreciate when I joined the firm is that we have an open investment committee, and RIC is where everybody gets together and debates, would this or would this not be a good investment? And so the deal team for that particular deal will submit a memo, and it might be very brief. If in the case of what we call a dashboard memo, it's just sort of a, hey, we found this company, might be something there. But the more detailed ones are where you really have to make a decision as an investment committee, and that's where it's fascinating, because I get to learn about every business in every sector, from the wine business to you name it. It's all coming through the transom. So I can get to see how investors think and what makes a good business, what makes a risky business. And once we move forward, at least, you can then measure based on your memos that you saw in investment committee, did this actually come out the way we thought it was going to come out? So,
and if any of your proposals had met the fate of your investment committee in a negative way? Or...
Thus far, no. We've been pretty judicious, and that's one of the other things I've learned as well. It's sort of like life. It's much better to do a good deal later on than to do a deal now just to get something across the transom. And I'm sure you saw this on Capitol Hill too. There's sometimes this impulse to say, okay, we've got to do something because we just have all this energy pent up. Same way in the private equity world too. You might have dry powder, as they call it, capital that's been committed but not allocated yet. And there might be a temptation to say, okay, let's just do a deal. But we're value investors at the end of the day. And so we're always looking to make sure that whatever we commit to is something that we can go to our LPs and say, look, this is a really good investment. We have downside protection. We have upside potential. There's really a good risk reward here. And so, knock on wood, at least thus far since I've been at the firm, we've made some pretty good decisions.
And does private equity care at all about the DC communications debates that we've used to fight on a day in, day out, and agree on so much? Do they care about that? Does it change the equation at all?
Yes or no. I would say on the margins for certain businesses, it can affect the way we think about an investment. For example, if they change the rate of reimbursement for Medicaid, then one of our businesses that involves home health care could be affected very directly. In our world, at least in telecom, of course, there are some big picture things that we do follow quite a bit. The bulk billing proposal, for example, the reimposition of Title II, of course, digital discrimination. But I wouldn't say we follow it with the intensity that people in our world used to follow it when we were at the commission. And but that's not to say we don't pay attention to DC. What I found in this world is that regulatory and legislative decisions can have a very significant impact. Price regulation is the easiest example of that. I know some people on Capitol Hill or at the FCC might wave away the prospect of Title II price regulation. Oh, it doesn't really matter. What's the big deal? All these companies are making money. But I can tell you that to the extent that there is the prospect of federal or especially state price regulation, that significantly deters us from wanting to make investments in some cases, and because it's just part and parcel of, is this a business-friendly environment or not? And for these capitals to build networks, which is really hard, they require a lot of capital. For us to allocate that capital, we have to be assured that there's going to be some reasonable expectation of a return on that investment. And to the extent that states or the federal government is micromanaging how we operate those businesses, or how our portfolio companies operate, it doesn't deter us, I think, from some of the more productive activities. And this is indeed a global market, by the way. It's capital that we allocate can be allocated anywhere in the world. We have offices in Europe that do deals. We've done deals in Asia, you name it. So to the extent that capital is fickle, I would certainly encourage those who are in a position to think about these things in the United States to make sure that your state, your nation, these are good places to do business.
That's incredibly interesting. You're seeing firsthand what we heard from people who come in to make those arguments. You would talk to people on Wall Street. You talk to the financiers, but you're actually seeing it from your desk. Seeing the experiences out. That's great to hear.
Oh, the other piece of M&A I should have mentioned is that to the extent that M&A is a more unpredictable process, that makes it very difficult as well, because at the end of the day, private equity is not just about making the investment, but exiting the investment once you've improved the business. And so to the extent you're selling to, say, a strategic, another big company, if those types of deals are held up for reasons unknown, it makes it more difficult to underwrite some of these investments in the first place.
And do you think the FCC, do we think our old world now, or maybe in the past, understands private equity? Do they have a negative or a positive, viewpoint on private equity?
It's a good question. Certainly when I was there, speaking only for myself, I didn't fully appreciate how private equity works. I mean, I obviously knew that there were private investors out there looking to back companies in the telecom and tech and media space, but I didn't fully appreciate the value that they can bring, or just even how private equity firms operate. Every firm is different. They all have different investment theses, different ways of doing business. The other thing I didn't appreciate fully as well is that different private equity funds within a certain firm operate differently. So we have our flagship buyout fund, our private equity fund. We also have a digital infrastructure fund, which have it's a different rate of return expectation, a different time horizon for holding the investment, and so that is a more long-term focused fund. We also have a credit fund, which operates more opportunistically and is doing more short-term investments. And so that kind of thing I didn't really appreciate at the FCC at all. I just knew that there was something called private equity out there, and it was one undifferentiated mass. But in terms of the current FCC, we do get some hints that there is a little more skepticism veering on hostility of private equity. And I'm thinking, for example, about one of the broadcast deals that was turned down, which I know you've written and talked about quite a bit, and some of the commentary there about the role of private equity, and I don't know the facts of that particular case as well as you or others, but just the tone of it seemed to suggest that private investment in the sector might be a bad thing. And at least for the businesses that we back, all I can tell you is I urge you or anybody who's skeptical about PE to just talk to these CEOs, talk to the line workers. I mean, we're backing these companies that are looking to grow, that are building infrastructure where people haven't built infrastructure before. And we're hiring people, and we're really doing a good job in these markets. And to me, at least, it's the best of both worlds. Like, yes, obviously, as any business would, our goal is to do well, but we're also doing good in these communities. And I think the private markets have a very important role to play, in addition to the public capital markets, or certainly the public sector itself.
So talk a little bit about your investments in the broadband side of the equation, without talking about specifics, but just in general. Talk about, you mentioned BEAD program. Do you have you participated in the Treasury Capital Grants Program or the Reconnect program at Agriculture Department? Did any of your investments participate in those programs?
Yeah, great question. So our broadband thesis is twofold. One, which we formed before when I was still at the FCC, but is really materializing now, is that there's a great opportunity to buy some copper-based assets that have been historically underinvested, put cash on the balance sheet to help fund essentially overbuilding of yourself in some of these markets where you might have a dominant cable company, but very little other competition. And so there, for example, we carved out the assets of Frontier in the Pacific Northwest, which is Ziply Fiber. And when we made the investment, my numbers might be a little bit off, but essentially the network was something like 15% fiber and 85% copper. And we've essentially tried to flip that and provide competition to the cable incumbent in that area, but also you really provide a high quality service. And there our NPS score is really high. We're building more fiber every day, and we're looking to participate in BEAD in some of those edge out markets where we think that the unit economics are attractive. Same thing with the consolidated communications, which is predominantly in the Northeast, but it's throughout the several states. There too, that we're overbuilding ourselves. So that's one thesis, sort of that what I'd call the brownfield thesis that we have on broadband. But with some of the funding streams that are coming out as a result of the CARES Act and ARPA, and of course with the infrastructure law, we came up with a more greenfield-oriented thesis. We thought, okay, all of these areas in rural America, which are unserved and underserved, are unserved and underserved for a reason. I'm sure you saw during your time at the FCC. These are relatively rural areas. It's more expensive to serve them. In some cases, the geography might be pretty challenging. You might have rock or other topographical challenges to overcome in order to build. And moreover, in those areas, the per capita income might be lower than it might be in more densely populated urban areas. And so one of the things that we thought was, okay, with all of these public funding streams coming out, we can now leverage some of that to back companies which are small, focused on one particular state, for example, but are looking to grow. They have really talented management teams that are ready and eager to build in a state. And that's what we've done in Arizona, Indiana, and Virginia, backing entrepreneurs who are just really hungry, want to get out there and build. And now they've got cash to be able to do it from us. And they've leveraged some existing funding streams. You mentioned Reconnect, which one of our companies, WeCom, has successfully deployed. There are others too. All Points Broadband, for example, in Virginia has leveraged the VATI program, the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative. And the former governor of Virginia in the, I think it was the 21 season, allocated $700 million for broadband deployment. And All Points Broadband was awarded in total about $300 million of that. And so they're building out now very aggressively. BEAD, of course, is the big program now. And so we're looking, all of these companies, both the brownfield and greenfield, are looking to leverage that. And so we think it's a unique opportunity to finally get this problem solved once and for all. And our goal, at least, is to be accountable to all of our constituents, our LPs, of course, but also our companies, customers, stakeholders in the state, the federal government. We want to do the right thing by building efficiently. It's in our interest to do so. And then, of course, it's one thing to build it, then we want to market it as well and make sure that people actually get the service that they've long desired.
So let's talk a little bit about the BEAD program. You've been in the nuts and bolts and seen it from the investment side of the equation. You remember your RDOF days and your past.
My gosh.
Come back to the new program. Are you surprised on some of the decisions that NTIA has baked into the program and some of the states and how they've approached things as you're getting ready to apply, right? As they're getting their allocations and going through the challenge process, et cetera?
Yeah, it's certainly been different from some of the FCC programs that we worked on, including RDOF and CAF2 and the like. So I guess on one side, on the federal side, the NTIA has put out a very detailed NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, of course, which outlined a number of different rules, some of which I think have been favorable for those who are operators and investors. Namely the fact that the funding is going to proceed along a defined schedule. Once they get approval of Volume 2, there's a one-year period for the state to get its work done. And so that time certainty is very helpful. On the other hand, there have been some things that have raised some questions. The specter of price regulation, even though the statute, of course, says that there shall be no price regulation, there have been reports publicly that some states have had their Volume 2 approvals held up as a result of their
look at Virginia.
That's one of the examples that has been used, of course. And so I think that back and forth is pretty unhelpful because at the end of the day, I think our interest in swift execution, in addition to the statutory mandate and price regulation, is pretty clear. There have been a few others too. The letter of credit requirement, for example, which I probably wouldn't have thought as seriously about until I talked to some of our operators who said, look, that's a real restraint on working capital. You've got to tie up a lot of money that would have gone towards deployment if you have to have a 25% letter of credit, 25% of your overall award amount. And so getting more flexibility from NTIA on that has been helpful. The Buy America requirement relaxation has been pretty helpful too. So we'll see. It's a very long document. All the guidance has been pretty complex to navigate, but hopefully you will be able to navigate that thicket. Oh, and the other thing I should mention is that every state is different too. So what we found is that some states, when you read their Volume 1 and Volume 2 initial proposals, it becomes pretty clear that it's just going to be too complex or difficult to be able to participate. So there are some states where we just unfortunately had to throw up our hands and say, look, we cannot find a way to do business in this state given how onerous these requirements are.
And does the state acknowledge that, or they're just like, well, we have plenty of other people?
I think it's more the latter, unfortunately. And the proof's going to be in the pudding. That's one of the good things about federalism, I suppose, is even though it's a federally administered program, it's essentially 50 different state programs at this point. So we'll see which ones work and which ones don't. But in our view, the ones that are working the best are the ones that really welcome private investment, because at the end of the day, it's both fiscally conservative because you're inviting more private investment to take the place of public sector funding, but it's also more accountable at the end of the day, because that means you have alignment between not just the person who's awarding the funding from the state office, but also the private sector entity that's going to be receiving that funding. And so we provide the match that enables these companies to participate and ultimately build.
Well, maybe that's a great point to jump off to a question about the states and how the states are handling this. Recently, Chris Sambar, I want to get his name right, head of networks for AT&T, and a likely be bidder, or certainly interested AT&T is, had this quote: "Some people have experience in those broadband offices, some were appointments." Is there a noticeable difference in broadband offices? Do you see that when you're talking to them? Some we know are have been doing this for quite a while, and others were required to by the statute and now are getting the legs under them.
I think what I would say is that in the states that we've operated in or have considered operating in, I've been very impressed with the state broadband offices. We spent a lot of time in Virginia. That was the first investment we made with this greenfield thesis I described. And the Virginia office there, the DHCD, has been fantastic, as has been all other levels of the Virginia government who were involved, all the way up to the governor's office. And this has been a bipartisan issue too. Governor Youngkin's team has been terrific on these issues. And I think they recognize, as most people do, that this is not a partisan issue. Broadband access is the one thing maybe that all Americans agree on. There are other states too where we've worked, and I've been really impressed with some of the folks who we've seen in some of these state broadband offices. And so from my perspective, at least, the constraint has been, are they fully staffed up enough to handle a very complex program?
Have you run into those states where there's one or two in the office?
Yeah, it's been tough for them. I really feel for them, because look, at the FCC, we had an entire wireline competition bureau in addition to an auction staff and economists and others you could bring from other disciplines you can bring to bear. If you're running a program that's, say, $1 billion or $500 million, that's a lot of money to be able to allocate. And moreover, you have to allocate it based on a process that's specified by the NTIA, which can be very difficult. Running a challenge process is a very simple example of that. But going forward, I think one of the biggest challenges that at least I haven't seen a lot of press coverage of is what happens if you have small project areas and you have multiple applications that are partially overlapping. How do you resolve those disputes? There's no objective way to do it necessarily, and so you're going to have people really thinking carefully about who do you make the award to. And if you make the award to one person who's, say, covering this part but not here, then who are you going to get to serve this part, which is relatively uncertain and underserved, and where the capital requirements are just prohibitively difficult. So it's going to be tough for some of those states, I think.
What do you think of the timelines? Where there was this original belief that 2025 was the envision. Yeah. I think that's slipping a little bit, and I'm really interested in your take on hearing 2026, maybe even bleeding to 2027, and that's just to get the money to the providers which you're investing in. That's just to get the money to them. Then you have actually the build timeline. But what do you think of the timelines? Are they slipping as it seems from here in my seat?
It has slipped a little bit. I think originally we had anticipated that Volume 2 approvals would be issued by the end of last year, as Louisiana got, and we just thought that would be kind of the gun at the starting line, and everybody would be racing to get the funding allocated, if not spent by the companies, of course, but by December of this year. So now, with only a handful of states approved, we're still kind of in a holding pattern for some 46 states, and so we're not sure if those are going to be approved. And even if they are approved, then some of the states are going to have at least 1 year, and I would expect they're going to take longer than that in some cases to run the full process. And so, I think ballparking it, even if every remaining state were approved today, you'd be looking at a competitive process that doesn't really conclude until the summer of next year, if we're lucky, maybe even the fall of next year. So it's going to be tough. And then, of course, there's a 4-year deployment period. So one of the things we're trying to think about is, as I mentioned, when we invest in these companies, we're putting cash on the balance sheet to help them build. But if the build that is related to the BEAD program isn't going to be starting for, say, a year, are there other projects that we can fund for them in these areas that it can at least get these work crews going so that we can show, look, we're not just standing on our laurels looking for a handout. We're actually building. We're starting to do some of those pilot projects now, and it really helps build, I think, public confidence for our companies, but it's also good business for us to be the first to connect some of these communities. And we do have a primary fiber focus in some of these companies, but that's one of the things that we hope will stand out for us in the market.
Well, I've driven through parts of Virginia and seen the signs all point to.
Oh, have you really?
Yeah, I've seen that coming. It's coming soon. Kind of promise to there. What's your take on where we're going to be at the end of BEAD? 4-year building process. When we look back as former policymakers, we look back and go, they got to some percentage. Do you think we're going to get to 100, or do you think we're going to be, somewhat short of that, and we're going to have to figure out something after the fact?
Yeah, one of my favorite books of all time is actually by Justice Breyer, which I read in law school, called Closing the Vicious Circle. And one of the basic points he makes in that book is that regulators spend a lot of time worrying about the 100%, when in reality, that last 5% of any problem is just devilish to solve. And if anything, that understates the case when it comes to broadband. Despite the fact that the Congress has allocated over $42 billion for deployment, I think that most people realize that, assuming you set the extremely high cost threshold relatively high, thus putting a premium on fiber, that's not going to be enough to cover every single location with fiber, maybe not even with fixed wireless as well. And so I think that we're going to solve a lot of the problem over time. And then there's, of course, the question of, do recipients actually do what they say they're going to do with the funding? And so I think it's going to be very important for the NTIA or any other cop on the beat on the state level to really be a good steward of those funds and make sure that people do what they say they're going to do.
I've given that speech to quite a number of states and said, don't be that state that screws this up. Don't be the provider that screws this up, because DOJ is going to come looking for you.
And I've said that when I speak to the state broadband offices, even when I'm wearing my Searchlight hat, that look, what matters at the end of the day is not the press release that announces this much funding is being pushed out the door or this company has gotten the funding. And what matters is, are the consumers in that project area going to get reliable broadband at the end of the day? That's what really matters. And so, to me at least, accountability is really important. And you're drawing on some of the experience we had from our programs, some of which were successful, some of which were not, to be candid. I think it would be helpful for all of these states and the federal government to learn from that.
I think the success is the family that got broadband that didn't have it before, right?
Yeah.
And it may not have gotten everywhere. And what do you think if this last 5% of the unserved is satellite? It's been shot at for so many different years. Do you think satellite's a realistic opportunity now that we've seen LEOs take off and we're going to have more LEO come operational soon?
I think both LEOs and fixed wireless are going to have a role to play, and at the very least in some of these corner cases where you've got a couple of homes that are in a square mile where it's predominantly rock. I mean, it's just the unit economics of building to those locations with fiber, especially if it has to be buried, is just impossible. And so I do think that there's going to be a role for LEOs and fixed wireless to play. And here, I'm really grateful for the reforms that we got across the finish line in our time to give some of these companies in these upstart industries a chance to succeed. I mean, we authorized the first LEO constellations that have really gotten traction in the market. We pushed more spectrum into the commercial marketplace for the fixed wireless companies. We made it easier for wireless infrastructure to be deployed so that these fixed wireless companies could get towers erected or get the other infrastructure necessary in order to provide service. Much more fiber was deployed during our time to help with backhaul. And so those types of things are, I think, giving these industries a chance to provide service in a way that was unthinkable when we came into office. I mean, 10 years ago, I think when most people thought of WISPs, for example, they probably thought about a 1 or 2 man shop that was leveraging some spotty Wi-Fi spectrum to provide subpar service. But look now, I mean, we see in the marketplace that there are companies leveraging some of this new gear to deploy gigabit symmetric service, or you see T-Mobile leveraging 2.5 spectrum, which we made available to them through the Sprint merger, to develop pretty attractive service on fixed wireless. So I think for those who were skeptical about some of the things we did at the FCC, I think the proof is in the pudding. The marketplace now is far more competitive than it was before, and there's much more innovation than there was before, and that's going to redound to the benefit of consumers, especially in those areas where fiber supported by BEAD might not be able to reach.
Let's switch topics just a little bit.
Sure.
Towards the end of your tenure, you spent a great deal of time on the security of networks as relates to exposure from many foreign adversaries, including Communist China Party. What's your take on where things are overall? And then also recently, there's been activity in the space. Our former colleague's been really outspoken on the issue, understandably. And then Capitol Hill's engaged, with passing a law the president signed as it relates to TikTok. Yeah. And I'd like to get your take as someone who has such a pedigree on the constitutional side, worked on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and knows these issues very well. I take on the First Amendment angle.
So certainly with respect to the first, I'm proud of not just of the work we did during our time, but also that work has continued in the current administration. I think that's one area where Democrats and Republicans at the FCC have spoken with one voice. And I'm really grateful to Chairwoman Rosenworcel and her team for continuing those efforts and extending them on all sorts of different security-related matters. And at least for us, we saw the threat emerging for a while, and started to get these briefings in our SCIF at the FCC and getting worried. And additionally, there was a push in some of these international fora by the Chinese Communist Party or by Huawei, ZTE, to really start to set the standards for 5G. And that set off alarm bells, not just in our agency, but in other agencies. And so I spent a decent amount of time in 2018, 2019, 2020 on the road with counterparts at state, at DHS, CISA, at the White House National Security Council, and elsewhere, just trying to persuade allies to see things our way. And at first it seemed hopeless. A lot of these countries that we visited, or companies in other countries, would say, "Where have you been? Huawei's already made us a deal that's 30% cheaper than the alternatives," or ZTE was here and we've got a 70% deal with a locked-in contract that guarantees us service for that kind of thing. But now the tide has turned. I think the veil has been ripped off, and I think people understand in other countries that the only problem with cheap is that it can sometimes be too expensive, either literally or in the sense of compromising your national security. And here on our shores too, I think a lot of the work we did, barring the use of USF funding from being used by U.S. telecom carriers, has been really important. We started put in place the policy infrastructure for rip and replace, which has been really important as well. And of course, Congress is going to have a role in fully funding that program as well, as they see fit. But at some point, so I'm really, on this issue, I'm really grateful, because I think when we came into office, it was sort of received wisdom that the government didn't really have a role, or maybe it had a role, but it should be very laissez-faire when it comes to the security of our communications networks. And that's certainly not where we left the baton. With respect to TikTok, there I think Congress has been right in saying, look, if you are a company that's subject to the control of a foreign adversary, then you have to divest or otherwise face prohibition on access to U.S. communications networks. And based on all the First Amendment related commentary that I've seen, this does not strike me as a content-based restriction that a court would strike down. It seems like there are legitimate national security concerns that are animating the Congress to impose this. And I don't think that this is going to be ultimately barred by a court. Certainly, if it gets to the Supreme Court, we'll see. But this strikes me as well within the fairway. If they'd singled out, based on the content over the network, TikTok, that would be one thing, but that's not the way the law is structured, at least as I read it.
Do you think there's other TikToks out there that likely are going to face similar treatment? The law envisions that. Do you think there's others that are going to be captured eventually?
It could be. I mean, certainly AI is, of course, the new flavor of the month, and one could conceive that there are all sorts of LLMs being developed by companies that are Chinese-based that might be subject to the jurisdiction of the Chinese Communist Party that ultimately may raise concerns, similar concerns. So we'll see where it evolves. But I think that's one thing that's good about this framework, is that it really addresses, in a thoughtful way at least, the question of which company should have access to our communications network. And again, if it's subject to the control of a foreign adversary, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, I think it's pretty, most Americans would say that's a pretty reasonable line to draw in terms of who should have access.
Step back for a little bit. Let's get to a little bit easier questions. You've been out of government for 3.5 years.
Well, yeah.
Do you miss it? Would you go back in for the right setting? Is there a job that can entice you? Or have you left that behind and said, I've moved on?
So the first question is the easiest. I do miss the FCC. I really love the people there. I spent 11 years there, not just as the chairman or commissioner, but also as a staffer. And so I truly love that agency, and I love the people at the agency, and I miss seeing people in the hall and saying hello and things like that. The other thing is sort of bittersweet for me is that COVID hit in March of 20, as you recall. And so I never got to say goodbye to people, and it was honestly kind of strange to bid them farewell over a Teams call or a YouTube video that I put out, I think the day before I left office, day before Inauguration Day, and it just wasn't the same. I remember as a staffer visiting or being in the commission meeting room when I think it was Chairman Martin left, when Chairman Janikowski left, and then Chairman Wheeler left, and I really missed being able to say goodbye to them. More fundamentally, I do miss just the chance to work with them on all these different issues that I really care about, bridging the digital divide and all the spectrum battles over 5G or more 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi spectrum, or 988 is a 3-digit number. I mean, even now, I was just on a university campus not long ago, and someone pointed out a 988 poster that was pinned to one of the light poles. I was like, wow, we did that. Like, our agency did that. And, just getting to work alongside these talented professionals on something like that was just such a rewarding experience.
Well, I hate that it brings a smile to our face, but the people in the darkest moment, that could be a huge benefit.
Oh, it's huge. Yeah, I mean, you get to see the stats are incredible. As I understand it from SAMHSA, they put out, I can't remember the exact number, but hundreds of thousands of people who would not have called 1-800-273-8255-8273-TALK can remember 988 and are dialing 988, and that's lives saved, and that's a really impressive thing.
Not to health during COVID was certainly faced its moment. So
it was a very difficult time for a lot of people, I think. But as for whether I go back,
yeah, you didn't answer that.
Yeah, no, I would go back. I spent the bulk of my career in public service, and there's something to be said for waking up in the morning, having a good cup of coffee, rolling up your sleeves, and just getting to work on behalf of the American people. And it would have to be the right role. I wouldn't go back to the FCC. I've been there and I've done that, and I think it's time for someone else to run with that baton and do the best job that she or he can. But there are other opportunities for public service too, and we'll see what comes my way. That's one of the things I've learned in my career, as I'm sure you did too, that you can never predict where opportunity is going to materialize. All you can do is just be ready to walk through that door when it opens, and that's certainly how I carry it in my heart, at least.
Is there anything during your FCC time that you're like, you know what, we really got that one wrong? That was a mistake. I can't believe I fumbled that one.
There are many, many mistakes I made. I don't think
that's right. I don't think that's right, but go ahead.
I certainly wish if we had known in 2018 and 2019 that like $42 billion would be allocated through RDOF, through the infrastructure law for broadband, that there'd be billions more through ARPA and CARES Act. And we would have structured RDOF very differently, right? I mean, it's like at the time we thought, okay, we essentially have a $2 billion annuity for the next decade per year, and that's what we have to play with. So we structured it in a certain way to deal with that. But look, if you knew there's going to be a lot more funding, then we could have done things very differently. And that wasn't our fault necessarily. Like we just didn't. No one could have had a crystal ball knowing that COVID was going to hit and this big infrastructure package was going to get done in that environment. The only other regret I have, I suppose, is on E-rate. I came up with a proposal. I don't remember if you were at the commission this time. No, I think Commissioner McDowell was still there. Essentially a student-centered E-rate program so that money would be allocated based on the number of students, and essentially that E-rate funding would track the student. And so just a much easier way, much more equitable way of making sure that every school and district got its fair share without having to hire an E-rate consultant and kind of try to game the system. And then also it would be a much more streamlined process. At least at the time, you had to fill out 7 different forms through 6 different steps. And if you made a single error, if you got the zip code wrong by 1 digit, you were bounced into this appeals process, and it was just really, really complex. And so this would have simplified everything, made it much easier for schools and libraries to participate. But look, that said, not to say that E-rate's not important, but in the broader scheme of things, I think we got our agenda done. And that's one of the things that was really important to me when I talked to some of my predecessors before taking office, and even in the early days of taking office, I would ask them, well, what is your one regret? And to a person, each of them said, I wish I'd done more. And so one of the things I always kept in my mind, and I told my team to keep in mind, is let's not leave in January 21 or whenever it is we leave saying, okay, I wish we had done more. And so for my part, at least, I think we really left everything on the field. I'm really proud of the work we all did together. And you know, it was a tough 4 years, to say the least. But at the end of the day, I mean, I would think anybody viewing this objectively would have to say that we did everything we could with the tools that were given to us, and we weren't marking time. We really made a difference, and that's why we do these jobs in public service, right? Is to make a positive difference for the American people. So,
well, that is a wonderful way to end. I can't thank you enough for your hospitality and spending and sharing your views on important topics. Thank you so very much.
Always good to see you, my friend.
Pleasure, my friend.
Likewise.